The main element of survival for all Australian prisoners of war was food, how to get it and how to keep on getting it. In Reg Worthington's camp in Salonika in Greece during the Second World War, one food supply came from an unlikely source.
I know at one stage there was a little fox terrier dog came into the area. I think he was a foxy, but a dog similar to the size of a foxy. We all chased him. Our bloke caught him. He tasted pretty good in the stew. Poor little dog. But survival was very strong.
Only a limited amount of food was supplied to POWs, and it would never be enough for everyone. So the dividing and sharing of food became incredibly important.
They had nothing there to give us much to eat but a bit of watery cabbage soup in the morning. You used to get a small round flat loaf about that big, had to go to 8 prisoners, so you got a little wedge. And that in itself, was, if it wasn't serious, was comical, because you'd select one to cut it and all the eyes would be on that he didn't get any more than the next one. And then, of course, you drew cards to have your pick. And I can tell you, I doubt if there wouldn't have been a slither of stuff more on one cut than the other. And that's all you got all day. And,
In the Japanese camps, the prisoners had to quickly get used to a food that Australians didn't really eat at that time: rice.
Mother used to make a rice pudding sometimes with eggs and bread or something, and custard, this sort of thing. We didn't know how to cook. Australia didn't know how to cook rice in the 30s and 40s, not like we do today. So they asked all the fellas to supply their dixies, which is their eating dixie, and we dug a long trench, several long trenches, and gathered up burnable material, made long fires and put the rice. And they knew that you boiled rice, so you put a dixie of rice and you put some water in it and put it in the fires. And of course, as the water boiled, the rice came over the top of the dixies and put the fire out, and then didn't cook and everything. Oh. But slowly, as time went by, we learned how to cook rice, didn't we?
Most of the rice the Japanese gave the prisoners was of terrible quality. It was often contaminated with rat droppings and worms, and a lot of it was simply sweepings from barn floors. Howard Walker, the son of missionary parents, was a 14-year-old boy in an internment camp in China, and here he reads a poem written by another prisoner about the miseries of eating this rice.
We got baked rice and caked rice that weevils made their bed in. We got bad rice, sad rice that filled you with its sorrow. We got podgy rice, stodgy rice that meant tummy pains tomorrow. We got limed rice, grimed rice, and ought to have been crimed rice. We brewed rice, we chewed rice. The lucky ones, they spewed rice. We starved on, but we lived on, in spite of everlasting rice.
The prisoners had to get protein wherever they could find it, and sometimes that meant they ate things they would otherwise never have considered. Even dirty rice could contain protein.
Later, our doctors wouldn't let them wash it because they had grubs and grub nests in it, and if you washed them out, you've washed all the vitamins out. So when you're eating your rice, you'd see little brown heads looking at you. So surprising what you can make out of a bowl of rice when you've been on it for so long. You can really imagine a nice roast dinner and roast potatoes and all this sort of thing. But you come back to the real world after a while.
It was such a nice fat worm, so I thought, I wonder what it would taste like. And then I found another worm, and then I found a clot of soil with lots of worms in it, so I gathered it all up and I cooked it. But of course, being worm, when you cook it, there's nothing left except a skinny bit. But as I said in my diary, a little bit of salt on it and made it was quite tasty. And then I found a nest of baby mice. And then once again, hunger overrides everything. I looked at it and just, looking at it, it's just, not only about that big, tiny little thing, nice and pink, and I was thinking, I wonder what that tastes like. And before I knew it, I'd opened my mouth and swallowed the thing.
The prisoners of war of the Japanese were provided with a totally inadequate diet that led to some starving to death.
If you didn't go to work, you didn't get fed. If you stayed back in camp, your rations were cut down, so you had to share. You got what was given to you as a sick patient, which was not always as much even as a working man. So if you got sick, you were not as well off as... It meant you didn't work, but it didn't mean you were going to survive any quicker.
The treatment of the period I was working on the railway line was absolutely horrendous. Not only in the way they worked, the way they were treated, the way they were fed, the way they were beaten, the way they were abused. They had no clothing, some were working in bare feet and a piece of rag tied around their waist. The food was disgusting, if you got it at all, sometimes twice a day. At one stage there we got it once a day. And people were dying like flies. We had cholera, we had malaria, we had dysentery, we had scrub typhus, we had beriberi.
Prisoners of war are at the mercy of the military force which captured them. They must abide by that force's rules, its culture, and particularly the orders of the guards. The prisoner is vulnerable and unarmed, and what happens to them is often unseen by the rest of the world. So the temptation for guards to punish and humiliate sometimes caused brutal behaviour. Lieutenant Terry Fairbairn had been captured in Crete and taken to a camp in Germany. During an interrogation, he made an offensive comment about Adolf Hitler, the German leader.
I was belted and belted and belted. I was shaved, all my body. Eyelashes were pulled out. Eyebrows gone. Every hair in my body went with a blade razor.
The Japanese believed that to surrender meant you had failed. The Australian soldiers they captured were thought of by them as possessions of the Japanese emperor, and as such, they could be dealt with in any way a prison camp commander decided.
You can't work out what he is doing, what he's thinking. They'll give you a hiding for something you wouldn't know what you've done. They just pick on you, pick on me for just because I was taller than he was or something, and find an excuse to give you a hiding. But we all got very ringing ears and all that sort of thing, bloody faces and so forth.
Cruelty to prisoners was not confined to the Japanese. During the Korean War, Philip Greville was placed by his Chinese interrogators into a small wooden crate that was the size of a refrigerator.
You couldn't stretch out in it, you couldn't stand up, you could barely sit up without hitting your head on the top. Then they put a South Korean soldier captured and wounded in. We couldn't converse very much, number 1, number 10. We're about the limits of our joint experience. And nevertheless, I was quite comfortable with him in the sense that he could sit opposite me and my feet, and his upper body sort of fitted the box reasonably well. But a few days later, they put in a civilian who was incredibly dirty. His clothes were filthy, his nails were filthy, and his manners were appalling. But the poor fellow had a rope around his neck, which were tied to his feet. And it was very difficult for us to let him sit in any way that gave him comfort. About the third night after he'd been in there, he managed to get some slack in the ropes, and he pushed his feet in such a way that the rope around his neck was strangling him. That was one of the incidents, I think, which made me decide that I was to get out of that box as soon as I could. I didn't think I would survive too long with the three of us in there.
In World War II, the Japanese wanted to build a railway line from Thailand to Burma that would enable them to supply their troops already in Burma. It was an idea that had been rejected by other nations before, on the grounds that the countryside was too dangerous and too many workers would be lost to disease. But the Japanese used the slave labour of their POWs. It was estimated that constructing the Burma-Thailand Railway involved building 4 million cubic metres of earthworks, moving 3 million cubic metres of rock, and building 14 kilometres of bridgeworks, all over a period of about 10 months, and using tools that would not have been out of place in the Middle Ages. 260,000 people were slave labourers on that railway, 61,000 of them POWs, 30,000 labourers and 12,399 prisoners would die, including 2,646 Australians. In that terrible place, the former POWs have the highest of praise for their doctors, without whom, they believe, thousands of them would not have made it home. James Ling remembers one doctor in particular, Roy Mills.
Just before we moved up, we were introduced to a doctor who was going to go with us. And he was a big, gangling, rosy-cheeked fellow. He looked about 18 or 19. And I can remember somebody near me saying when we were laying up, God, we've got a boy for a doctor. How's he going to handle this? At the end of 12 days and 12 nights, we had one of the greatest men in the world. He was absolutely fantastic.
Tom Uren worked alongside another doctor, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Weary Dunlop.
Weary's leadership wasn't pronounced or boasted about or loud-mouthed in any way. He was a very quietly spoken human being. He led by example. In our camp, under Weary, the strong was looking after the weak, the young was looking after the old, the fit was looking after the sick, and there was this collective philosophy.
Many of the Australian prisoners of the Japanese endured the terrible treatment they received and survived to live long lives back at home. But it has left its mark on all of them.
And I saw life at its best and its worst. I saw what human beings could do to each other, what hatred could do, and yet what faith could do, what kindness could do. And that's what we're here for, to help one another.